Usually when we talk about warfare, we kind of default to this, I don't know, this traditional chessboard mentality.
Right, the conventional mindset.
Yeah, exactly. You have your pieces, the opponent has their pieces, the board has these strict visible boundaries, and the objective is just obvious to everyone watching. You move your knight, they move their pawn, and you both know exactly what the rules of the game are.
Yeah, it assumes a state-on-state conflict where the ultimate goal is just to physically destroy the enemy's military capacity. It's very binary, I guess. You wear a uniform, you hold a front line, or you don't. You capture the capital, and the war's over.
Right. And there's something almost comforting about thinking of it that way. We really like our conflict to be easily mapped out with neat red and blue arrows on a satellite image.
Oh, absolutely.
But then you step into the world of irregular conflicts, subversion, and resistance, and suddenly you realize that the chessboard doesn't actually exist. The board is flipped over, the pieces are wearing everyday street clothes, and the lines are totally invisible. We're looking at a battle space that is incredibly murky.
Murky is the perfect word for it, because in this realm, the goal is not necessarily to destroy an enemy army. The goal is to outgovern the existing state. The battlefield is literally the human mind and the political allegiance of the population.
And that is exactly what we are getting into today. Welcome to the Doctrine Deep Dive.
Glad to be here for this.
We are thrilled to have you with us for this deep dive into the source material. Today, we are setting the stage for a master's-level exploration of resistance and insurgent strategy. Our mission with you today is to uncover exactly how unconventional conflicts are organized, fought, and ultimately won or lost by dissecting the underlying military doctrine.
And the fascinating geographical theory that drives them, too. It's a complex topic, but we have a phenomenal stack of doctrine and theory to guide us through it.
We really do. And we should explicitly name the sources driving today's conversation because they are, frankly, heavy hitters.
Definitely.
We are looking at the actual military playbook. Specifically, Army Techniques Publication 3-05.1, Unconventional Warfare at the Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force level, which was published in April 2021.
Right, the core doctrine.
Yeah, and we are balancing that against Robert McCall's seminal 1969 geographical analysis, The Insurgent State, Territorial Bases of Revolution.
Which is just a brilliant piece of work.
It is. And finally, to tie all that historical theory to the present day, we have David Maxwell's 2025 article from the Small Wars Journal titled Unconventional Warfare, Solving Complex Political Military Problems and Creating Dilemmas for Adversaries.
That combination of sources is really what makes this so interesting. You have the rigid, structured military doctrine trying to codify something that is inherently chaotic and, well, deeply political.
Exactly. And here is the core theme. The hook I want you to keep in the back of your mind for everything we are about to discuss today. Unconventional warfare is not just about operators running around in a dense jungle with weapons.
Right, that's just the Hollywood version.
Totally. The reality is that it is a highly intellectual, fiercely political, and deeply geographical chess match. The ultimate prize is not the destruction of an enemy, but the legitimacy to govern.
Which requires a massive mental shift. Because before we can even begin to understand how insurgents fight on the ground, we have to understand how military strategists think about either supporting them or defeating them.
Right. You
cannot just drop troops into a country and say, go start a resistance.
So let's dive into that mental shift.
Right.
I want to start with David Maxwell's modern perspective because he frames this perfectly. He actually calls it the thinking man's war.
He does, yeah.
Now, the doctrine itself has a very precise, very dense definition of unconventional warfare. Let me just read it here. According to the publication, it is defined as, quote, activities conducted to enable a resistance movement or insurgency to coerce, disrupt, or overthrow a government or occupying power by operating through or with an underground auxiliary and guerrilla force in a denied area.
I want to stop you right there and really look at the first few words of that definition.
Okay, sure.
Activities conducted to enable. Notice what is missing from that.
Well, it doesn't say anything about shooting, bombing, or invading.
Exactly. It does not start with direct combat. Enable is the crucial word here. In conventional warfare, the United States military is the primary actor. The military goes in, achieves the objective, and wins the day.
But not here.
No. In unconventional warfare, the military is absolutely not the primary actor achieving the final political result. The indigenous resistance movement is the primary actor.
Wow.
The military is merely the enabler. The resistance owns the victory, or, they own the default.
That is a huge distinction.
Yeah.
You are essentially stepping back and saying, we are going to help you win your own war. And what's fascinating is how Maxwell breaks down the specific capabilities of the forces required to actually pull this off.
Right, his Trinities concept.
Yes, he proposes a concept he calls the two special operations forces Trinities.
This is a brilliant way to conceptualize the skill set required. So the first Trinity represents what we might call the core capabilities. This is the what they do.
Okay.
These three pillars are unconventional warfare, irregular warfare, and support to political warfare.
Which sounds very standard military jargon at first glance, honestly.
It does, but it is the second Trinity that really changes the paradigm. The second Trinity represents their comparative advantage over conventional big army military forces.
And what are those pillars?
These pillars are governance, influence, and support to indigenous forces and populations. This is the how they do it.
Wait, I have to push back here a little bit.
Go ahead.
When we think of special operations forces, pop culture portrays them as purely kinetic. We picture night vision goggles, kicking down doors, jumping out of helicopters in the dead of night, and pulling off these incredibly violent, precise raids.
Right, the action movie stuff.
Yeah. But Maxwell is arguing that their core advantage is governance, influence. He even goes so far as to say that operators conducting these missions must be warrior scholars with doctorates of the battlefield.
He does use that exact phrasing.
Which implies a requirement for deep cultural, political, and historical understanding. So my question is, how does a team trained in elite combat tactics suddenly become experts in local taxation or tribal dispute resolution?
Well, that is the friction point of the entire concept. But think about what you are actually trying to achieve. If the ultimate goal of the resistance is to outgovern the existing state, then the people advising that resistance must understand governance.
Okay.
You cannot influence a local population if you do not understand their history, their deep-seated grievances, their tribal dynamics, and their political aspirations.
You'd just be completely blind.
Exactly. You cannot help an insurgent group build a shadow government if you have no idea how local governance traditionally functions in that specific province or valley. The kicking down doors part. That is actually the easy part.
Wait, the easy part?
Comparatively, yes. Kinetic action, the raids, the ambushes is a blunt instrument. It is necessary sometimes, but it is blunt. Unconventional warfare, on the other hand, is the scalpel.
The scalpel. I like that.
It is about solving irregular problems with irregular solutions. If you just kick down a door and capture a target, you have solved a temporary tactical problem. But if you convince a local tribal leader that the resistance can provide better security and fairer courts than the corrupt state government, well, you have fundamentally shifted the strategic balance of power in that region.
Okay, that makes perfect sense on a theoretical level. But how does the United States military actually operationalize that in the real world? How do you operationalize influence in the so-called gray zone between peace and war? Especially when we were dealing with massive state actors.
This is where Maxwell's argument becomes incredibly relevant to modern geopolitics. In the current strategic landscape, the United States is constantly engaging with adversaries like China, Russia, or Iran.
And they are very good at this.
Absolute masters of operating in that gray zone. They utilize proxy forces, economic coercion, paramilitary organizations, and massive information manipulation campaigns. If the United States only responds with conventional military threats like, I don't know, moving an aircraft carrier or threatening an armored invasion, we are playing the wrong game.
We would basically be using a sledgehammer to try and catch a fly.
Precisely. Unconventional warfare allows the United States government to create dilemmas for those adversaries without crossing the threshold into large-scale armed conflict.
Creating dilemmas. I love that phrasing from the reading.
Yeah.
It isn't about solving a problem perfectly. It is about forcing the adversary to make a series of bad choices.
Exactly. You want to stretch their resources. You want to undermine their legitimacy. You want to force them to spend billions of dollars policing their own territory because an underground movement is constantly disrupting their infrastructure.
So you're turning their size against them.
Yes. You turn the adversary's strength into vulnerabilities by leveraging the local population against them. You make them bleed from 1,000 tiny cuts, all while maintaining a minimal, almost invisible footprint yourself.
But to do that effectively, you can't just drop weapons out of an airplane and hope for the best. You have to deeply understand the anatomy of the resistance you are actually supporting, which transitions us perfectly.
It really does.
We know why unconventional warfare is used as a strategic tool. Now we need to examine what is actually being supported. What does resistance look like from the inside? Because the Army Techniques publication doesn't just give vague guidelines. It gives a very clear, rigid anatomy of the basic United States model of resistance.
It does. It breaks a resistance down into 5 distinct primary components. And understanding how these 5 components interact with each other is the key to understanding how insurgencies survive.
Okay, let's go through some.
The first, and arguably the most critical for early survival, is the underground.
The underground, let's break that down. This is the cellular, compartmentalized, covert element operating in denied areas, correct?
Yes. They're the ones operating right under the nose of the occupying power or the hostile state government. They live in the cities, they go to work every day. But in the shadows, they conduct covert intelligence gathering, sabotage, subversion, and psychological operations.
And their structure is incredibly specific. The doctrine emphasizes that they are cellular and compartmentalized. Why is that so crucial?
Pure paranoia and survival. Because the underground is operating in the very center of the enemy's power, they are in extreme danger. If the state police capture one member, that member can be interrogated or tortured. If the network is structured like a traditional military hierarchy, that one capture could lead to the entire organization being unraveled. So they operate in strict, isolated cells.
So they don't even know each other.
A person in one cell might only know the identity of one other person in the entire movement.
It's the classic spycraft model. You cannot betray what you do not know.
Exactly. But that compartmentalization creates a massive problem. Communication is agonizingly slow and inefficient. Passing a simple message might take weeks through dead drops and cutouts.
Okay, so that is the underground. And then you have the auxiliary, and this is where I think people get a bit confused because it sounds really similar to the underground. How do they differ?
The auxiliary is the clandestine support element. These are the people whose members do not openly show their sympathy for the resistance, but they aren't the ones planting bombs or gathering high-level intelligence either.
So they're blending in more.
They look like everyday citizens. They are the bakers, the farmers, the taxi drivers, but they are providing the vital logistics. They are managing the safe houses, smuggling medical supplies, forging identity documents, and gathering low-level ambient intelligence.
They are essentially the lifeblood.
They absolutely are. They connect the active fighters to the passive population. Without the auxiliary, the underground starves and the guerrilla force runs out of bullets. But they are vulnerable because they have to interact with the real world to get those supplies.
Which brings us to the third component, the guerrilla force. This is the one everyone knows. The overt military arm conducting paramilitary operations, the raids, the ambushes, the large-scale sabotage. This is the kinetic element.
Yes. But it is critical to remember that the guerrilla force is just one part of the whole ecosystem. They provide the physical security and the violent pressure against the state, but they are completely dependent.
Dependent on the others, you mean?
Exactly. They rely entirely on the underground for targeting intelligence, knowing exactly when the state military convoy is leaving the base, and they rely entirely on the auxiliary for the food, the medical care, and the ammunition required to actually execute the ambush.
It is a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah.
But here is where the reading got really interesting for me. The last 2 components are the public component and the shadow government. These are the political elements.
Right.
The public component is the overt political manifestation. They're the ones who might be sitting safely in a neighboring country, handling negotiations, managing international public relations, and pumping out propaganda to gain global sympathy.
They are the face of the movement to the outside world.
Right. And then you have the shadow government. That doctrine describes this as the elements providing parallel goods and services to supplant the existing state government.
And that shadow government is the ultimate key to victory. You cannot just destroy the enemy government. If you just burn down the state capital, you are left with anarchy.
Yeah, nobody wants that.
You have to replace it with something the population actually trusts and relies on.
Okay, I was thinking about this interplay while reading the doctrine, and I came up with an analogy. I want to see if this works for you. A resistance structure is basically a massive, highly organized, illicit corporate conglomerate.
Huh. I am intrigued. Walk me through it.
Think about the functional separation of duties. The public component, that is, the corporate public relations department. They are issuing press releases, managing the brand image, and talking to international investors, or in this case, foreign governments willing to provide funding.
Okay.
The auxiliary is the supply chain and logistics division. Their job is keeping the warehouses stocked and the delivery trucks moving invisibly. The guerrilla force. That is your hostile corporate security. They are out there actively dismantling the competition's physical assets and making it too expensive for the state to operate in certain areas.
Okay, and the shadow government, where do they fit?
The shadow government is the executive board conducting a hostile takeover of the state's market share of governance. They're trying to steal the state's customers, the citizens, by providing a better product. Better dispute resolution, better security, fairer taxation, and better social services.
It is a really clever analogy, and it works up to a point. It perfectly captures the separation of specialized duties. But where your corporate analogy breaks down is the violence factor.
How so?
Well, Apple does not actively assassinate Samsung's regional managers. In a resistance, the violence changes the dynamic entirely, and it creates massive internal friction.
Friction between the different components of the resistance itself.
Exactly. What is fascinating here is that the resistance is fundamentally a political activity. The military activities of the guerrilla force are entirely subordinate to the political objectives of the shadow government. But guerrillas want to fight. They want to blow things up. The shadow government wants to govern and win the love of the people. If the guerrilla force uses too much violence or the wrong kind of violence, say they accidentally blow up a civilian market while trying to hit a state police convoy, they alienate the population.
Right, they become the bad guys.
They instantly bankrupt the political capital that the shadow government has been slowly building.
So the shadow government has to constantly restrain the guerrilla force.
Yes. Because without the will to resist from a base population, the entire structure collapses. The population is the true center of gravity in unconventional warfare.
The doctrine makes that very clear. The sea in which the guerrilla swims.
Exactly. If the state government can convince the population that the resistance is just a band of violent criminals or terrorists, the ecosystem dies. The auxiliary gets scared and stops smuggling food.
And the underground gets exposed.
Right, because citizens start reporting suspicious activity to the state police. And the guerrilla force, cut off from intelligence and supplies, is easily hunted down and starved out. The shadow government must constantly prove it is more legitimate, more just, and more capable than the existing state.
But a shadow government can't just exist in the minds of the people, right? It needs to actually collect taxes, run schools, and build hospitals. And you cannot build a hospital in thin air. You need physical space.
You do.
Which forces the insurgency to do something incredibly dangerous. They have to hold territory. How do insurgents literally carve a country out of an existing country?
That is the pivotal question, and this is where we turn to Robert McCall's masterpiece, The Insurgent State. This is a brilliant piece of geographical analysis that will completely change how you view a map during a conflict.
McCall argues that for contemporary national revolutions, capturing and controlling territory is a territorial imperative. It is not optional. It is a manifesto to the world saying, we have arrived, we are no longer just a nuisance, we are ready to replace the existing government. And he breaks this geographical evolution down into 3 distinct stages.
Right. The first stage is mobile war, and it is vital to understand how brutal this stage is. In this phase, the insurgent has no permanent base. They are weak, highly vulnerable, and completely outnumbered by the state military.
So what do they do? Just hide?
They run. They must constantly run and hide to trade space for time. The goal here is pure survival. They attack only when they have overwhelming local superiority, maybe isolating a single police checkpoint.
Yeah.
And the moment the state calls in reinforcements, the insurgents melt away back into the landscape.
It sounds utterly exhausting.
It is hell. It is incredibly wasteful of personnel and supplies. Think about it realistically. If you have no fixed bases, where do your wounded go? How do you treat a fighter with a gunshot wound when you have to march 20 miles through the jungle that night? You cannot. The wounded die. Where do you manufacture ammunition? You cannot. You have to steal it. That is why insurgents are desperate to survive mobile war and reach the second stage. Guerrilla war with fixed bases.
Right. Establishing a geographically secure haven, this becomes their core area. McCall points out something crucial here. People think a guerrilla base is just a hidden military camp with tents and weapons. But McCall says no. This core area contains hospitals, small factories, schools, and administrative centers. It is the beginning of the physical shadow government.
Exactly. It is a proto-state. And once they have those fixed bases, they push for the final stage. Equilibrium. This is when the insurgent movement expands these individual, isolated bases and starts linking them together to form a federal insurgent state that parallels the legitimate government. They start drawing their own boundaries, setting up their own administrative zones, and essentially establishing a dual-state reality. The citizen now lives in a world where two different governments are claiming sovereignty over the exact same piece of land.
Now, McCall shatters a huge misconception here that I really want to highlight. He talks about the myth of the rural revolution. Because you look at the history of insurgencies, and they're always hiding in the remote mountains, the deep jungles, the inaccessible swamps. So the natural assumption is that insurgents are essentially a rural phenomenon with rural goals. They want to control the countryside.
But that is an illusion born entirely of necessity. Insurgents do not hide in the freezing mountains or the malaria-filled swamps because they prefer rural areas. They hate it there as much as anyone else would.
They just don't have a choice.
They hide there because that is where the state's military and police reach is the weakest. It is a sanctuary of terrain. But their true targets, their ultimate political objectives, are always the centers of power. The cities, the major towns, the ports, and the critical lines of communication.
So when we hear Mao Zedong's famous strategy of surrounding the cities with the countryside, we misunderstand it. The countryside is a means to an end, not the end itself.
Exactly. The countryside is just the staging area where they build their strength. The city is always the prize. If you want to govern the state, you must ultimately control the economic and political hubs. You cannot run a national economy from a cave.
McCall also introduces this fascinating concept of geopolitical gerrymandering. I found this incredibly manipulative, but brilliant.
Yes, this is where the geography becomes a weapon. When an insurgent group sets up its own administrative zones in that equilibrium stage, they do not just politely copy the existing state's provincial borders, they completely redraw the map to suit their own political and military needs.
He uses a very specific historical example with the National Liberation Front in Vietnam. The legitimate state, the government of Vietnam, had something like 44 provinces based on traditional historical administrative lines. But the National Liberation Front ignored that.
They did.
They redrew their own map into only 35 provinces. And they actively divided regions based on ethnic lines, like grouping the Montagnard tribes together, rather than the traditional state boundaries.
Think about what that looks like on the ground to a villager. Imagine you live in a province where your ethnic group has always been a minority, ignored or oppressed by the distant state capital. Suddenly, the insurgency arrives. They declare that your village is now part of a newly drawn insurgent province where your ethnic group is the majority. They put local leaders from your tribe in charge of the shadow government.
That is a massive psychological hook.
It is absolute political genius. By granting autonomy to specific ethnic groups within their newly drawn boundaries, the insurgents instantly secured the fierce allegiance of those populations. They tailored the geography to exploit the political weaknesses of the state government. It is a masterful, deeply cynical use of political geography. They manufacture loyalty by literally redrawing lines in the dirt.
Okay, but this raises a massive logistical question for me. Let's say the insurgency successfully does this. They set up fixed boundaries. They build their fixed hospitals, their schools, their administrative centers. They declare their insurgent state.
Right.
Don't they just give the superior state military a giant unmoving bullseye to bomb? The state has an air force. The state has heavy artillery. How does holding fixed territory actually help the insurgents survive when they're basically giving the enemy exact coordinates?
It is the ultimate paradox of the insurgent state. Yes, holding fixed territory absolutely makes them a physical target. They will get bombed, they will take casualties. But the insurgents calculate that the psychological power of the map outweighs the military risk. Well, think about the message it sends. Holding territory, even contested territory that gets bombed occasionally, demonstrates to the local population that the state government is fundamentally weak. It proves the state cannot even protect its own borders or maintain sovereignty over its own land.
It shatters the illusion of state omnipotence.
Exactly. It is a massive blow to the state's prestige. And, just as importantly, it is a glaring signal to potential international sponsors.
Like foreign governments.
Right. If you are a foreign intelligence agency looking to weaken that state, you are not going to fund 5 guys running around a jungle. But if you see an insurgency that holds 3 provinces, collects taxes, and defends its borders, that is a viable proxy that is worth funding.
Furthermore, it provides a physical space, a sanctuary, where the insurgency can safely demonstrate its political and social programs. They can literally show the peasants, look, in our territory, the land is redistributed fairly, our schools teach your native language, our courts are not corrupt.
Yes. And from a military standpoint, holding that rural territory forces the state government into a massive dilemma. The state has to adopt a defensive posture. They have to pull their troops back and concentrate them to protect the cities and the critical infrastructure. By doing that, the state effectively yields the vast countryside entirely to the insurgents. The insurgents trade the risk of being bombed for absolute freedom of movement in 80% of the country.
Okay, let's pull all of this theory together. We have covered the mind of the insurgency, the thinking man's war, the focus on governance and influence. We have covered the physical body, the interplay between the underground, auxiliary, guerrilla force, public component, and shadow government. And we have covered the land, the territorial imperative, and the geopolitical weaponization of maps.
So the natural next question for military strategists is, how does the United States government actually engage with this massive, complex organism?
Exactly. How does the United States Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force actually execute a campaign to support a resistance? You don't just show up and start handing out rifles. The Army Techniques publication Doctrine walks us through a very specific timeline, the 7 phases of unconventional warfare.
The 7 phases provide the architectural framework for a long-term campaign. They are preparation, initial contact, infiltration, organization, buildup, employment, and transition.
I want to walk through what these actually look like on the ground because the doctrine makes it sound so clean, but the reality must be incredibly messy.
Oh, absolutely messy.
It starts with preparation and initial contact. This involves deep intelligence gathering, understanding the human terrain, and quietly, desperately trying to reach out to the resistance leadership.
It is incredibly delicate, high-risk work. Imagine trying to make initial contact with an underground cell operating in a hostile authoritarian capital city. You do not know who is a genuine rebel and who is a state police informant.
That's terrifying.
You are assessing the feasibility of the resistance. Do they actually have the will to fight, or are they just complaining? Do their political goals align with the strategic goals of the United States government? If you back the wrong faction, you create a disaster.
And once you verify they are viable, you move to infiltration. Getting the Special Operations Forces teams physically into the denied area. This could be covert border crossings, high-altitude parachute jumps at night, or smuggling advisors in through commercial cover.
And once they are in, you enter organization and buildup. This is where the real work of the advisor begins. The United States forces help the resistance expand their networks. They help the auxiliary secure better logistics lines. They train the guerrilla forces in advanced tactics, communications, and medical care. They are building the capacity of that illicit corporate conglomerate we talked about.
But the doctrine explicitly notes that these phases are not always perfectly sequential. It is not a neat checklist.
No, it is highly fluid. The next phase, employment, which involves the actual combat operations, the raids, the sabotage, the overt pressure against the state, does not politely wait for the build-up phase to finish.
Right. An insurgent group might be employing violent action in a northern province where they are strong, while simultaneously still desperately trying to organize and build up their networks in a southern province where they are weak.
Exactly. You are managing multiple phases simultaneously across different geographic zones.
To make this abstract doctrine concrete, David Maxwell applies these phases to a very real-world, highly relevant hypothetical scenario, the Korean Peninsula.
It is a sobering but highly educational scenario. He divides the application of unconventional warfare into 2 overlapping phases based on a potential hypothetical regime collapse in North Korea.
Right there. The first is pre-collapse, which is essentially phase 1, preparation. Maxwell argues that the United States and allied forces must begin today, right now, to identify and support latent internal resistance. You don't wait for the collapse to happen. This means clandestinely mapping leadership networks, understanding local grievances, and aggressively shaping the information environment.
You are laying the groundwork. You are preparing the fertile soil for the auxiliary and the underground before the crisis even triggers. You want a network ready to activate the moment the regime shows weakness.
But the post-collapse phase is where my mind really started spinning.
Yeah.
Because Maxwell points out a terrifying reality. If an authoritarian regime suddenly collapses, and conventional allied forces move in to stabilize the region, they will not be universally welcomed as liberators.
Far from it.
You will have a heavily indoctrinated population and potentially hundreds of thousands of remnants of the regime's military retreating to the mountains, forming a brand new insurgency against the stabilizing forces.
This is where the doctrine flips on its head in a fascinating way. Suddenly, you are transitioning from conducting unconventional warfare, supporting a resistance, to mitigating a new insurgency. You are now the state trying to maintain order.
Wow.
Maxwell argues that in this chaotic environment, you use those same unconventional warfare-trained personnel, but you do not use them for combat. You use them for their mastery of influence, their deep understanding of governance support, and their counter-resistance skills to prevent the region from descending into absolute chaos.
And this highlights how incredibly complex the seventh and final phase transition really is. I think this is the most overlooked part of warfare. You are moving from a multi-year mission of destroying and occupying power or a hostile regime to suddenly having to govern.
Yes.
You have to demobilize a heavily armed guerrilla force who have known nothing but violence for a decade. You have to integrate a secretive shadow government into a new, transparent, legitimate state apparatus. And you have to instantly restore basic services like power and water, or the population will turn on you.
Transition is without question the most dangerous phase of the entire campaign. It is where everything can fall apart. If the political end state, whether that is to coerce, disrupt, or completely overthrow a regime, is not perfectly aligned with a robust transition plan from the very beginning, the United States could just be funding the next generation of adversaries.
It is the ultimate blowback scenario. You could successfully overthrow a hostile regime, celebrate the victory, and then immediately watch the guerrilla force you spent years arming and training turn their weapons on the fragile new government you're trying to establish.
It has happened historically. It all comes back to Maxwell's initial premise. This is an intellectual endeavor. The kinetic action, the fighting, is almost the easiest part to plan. Navigating the political, social, and economic aftermath is the true test of the warrior scholar. It requires immense strategic patience. You are attempting to guide a volatile social revolution from the shadows, and you cannot control every variable.
So let's summarize this massive, complex deep dive for you, the listener. Unconventional warfare is the ultimate expression of what strategists call the indirect approach. It is not about matching tank for tank or fighter jet for fighter jet.
No, not at all.
It requires vast intellectual rigor, a profound, almost sociological understanding of human networks, and the strategic patience to help an oppressed population build an insurgent state from the shadows up.
It is about recognizing that every element has a critical role. It is the underground gathering secrets at great personal risk. It is the auxiliary moving supplies invisibly through the population. It is the guerrilla force creating military dilemmas that exhaust the state. And above all, it is the shadow government winning the political allegiance of the people by providing a better alternative.
And it requires doing all of this within the complex geographical reality of the host nation, slowly, painfully expanding the territorial imperative, redrawing the maps, and building fixed sanctuaries until the existing state simply crumbles under the weight of its own irrelevance.
It is a phenomenal undertaking, and understanding it is crucial for understanding how modern global competition actually works in the gray zone.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to ponder long after we wrap up today. Robert McCall wrote about the territorial imperative of the insurgent state way back in 1969. He proved convincingly that physical sanctuaries, like impenetrable mountains, deep jungles, and complex waterways, were absolutely vital for a resistance to survive its fragile early stages and build its parallel government.
They needed physical space to exist outside the state's reach.
Exactly. But I want you to consider this moving forward. As our world becomes entirely interconnected and digitized, what does the insurgent state look like in the 21st century? Can an underground, an auxiliary, and even a shadow government exist entirely in cyberspace, immune to physical borders?
That's a great question.
Can you organize revolution, collect untraceable digital taxes, and distribute propaganda without ever holding a single square mile of physical jungle? And if so, how does modern military doctrine possibly adapt to target a sanctuary that you cannot even point to on a map?
That is the next great frontier of unconventional warfare. When the core area is a decentralized server network rather than a remote mountain range, the chessboard changes entirely all over again. The principles of resistance remain the same, but the geography becomes virtual.
The map becomes blurred in a completely new dimension. It is a terrifying and fascinating thought. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We have covered a massive amount of ground today, and we hope it fundamentally changes how you look at the murky conflicts happening around the globe. Keep questioning the map, and we will catch you on the next one.